Hello, Slumber Seekers, and welcome to the Slumber Tales podcast, where we read to you some of our favorite stories. My name is Finian Schwarz, and I'll be your storyteller tonight. If you have a favorite story that you'd like us to read, share it with us. You can leave a comment if that's available, or email us at myslumbertales@gmail.com. That's myslumbertales@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our story for tonight. Chapter 3. Perdita.
"And now,"
said the splendid vet to the Dearleys,
"you must get a foster mother."
He explained that though Mrs. would do her best to feed 15 puppies, doing so would make her terribly thin and tired. And the strong puppies would get more milk than the weak ones. The puppy Mr. Dearly had brought to life was very small and would need special care. The largest pup of all had a black patch over its ear and one side of its face. This is a bad fault in a Dalmatian, which should be born pure white, as Mr. Dearly had told Cruella de Vil. Some people would have drowned this patched pup because it would never be valuable. But the Dearleys felt particularly fond of it because it had started life with a bit of bad luck, and they liked being able to recognize it. Until the spots started to come through some weeks later, the big puppy with the patch and the small, delicate puppy were the only ones who could be told apart from the others. The splendid vet said the foster mother would have to be some poor dog who had lost her own puppies, but still had milk to give. He thought he could get such a dog. But as he wasn't sure, the Dearleys had better telephone all the lost dogs' homes, and until the foster mother was found, they could help Mrs. by feeding the pups with a doll's feeding bottle or an old-fashioned fountain pen filler. Then the splendid vet went home for an hour's sleep before starting his day's work. Nanny Cook got breakfast, and Nanny Butler took Pongo for a run, and Mrs. was persuaded to leave her family for a few minutes' walk. When she came back, Mrs. Dearly had tidied the cupboard. Mrs. gave the second lot of puppies a meal, and then she and her family of 15 had a glorious sleep. And Pongo, down in the kitchen, had a glorious sleep too, knowing that all was well. As soon as the shops opened, Mrs. Dearly went out and bought a doll's feeding bottle and a fountain pen filler. Then Mr. Dearly and the nannies took turns at feeding puppies. Mrs. Dearly fancied this job herself, but was busy telephoning, trying to find a foster mother. The nannies were too fat to be comfortable in the cupboard, so soon Mr. Dearly got the feeding job all to himself, and became very good at it, and just a bit bossy. Of course, he couldn't go to business, which was awkward, as he had an important business deal on. Luckily, there was a telephone in the Dearlys' bedroom, and it had a long cord to it. So Mr. Dearly was able to telephone while he was feeding the pups. There he was, in a dark cupboard with Mrs., 15 puppies, and the telephone. He nearly upset his important business deal by holding a pup to his ear and giving the telephone a drink of milk. No sooner had Mr. Dearly put the telephone down than the splendid vet rang up to say he had not been able to find a foster mother. Neither had Mrs. Dearly anywhere in London. She now started to ring up lost dogs' homes outside of London. It was late afternoon before she heard of a mother dog with some milk to give, nearly 30 miles from London. And this dog had only just been brought in and would have to be kept some days in case she was claimed. Mr. Dearly put his head out of the cupboard. After being up all night and feeding pups all day, he was beginning to feel pretty tired, but he was determined to go on helping Mrs. until the foster mother arrived.
"Why not, go and see if you can borrow that dog?"
he said.
"Say we'll give it back if its owner turns up."
So Mrs. Dearly got the car from the old stable at the back of the house and drove off, hopefully. But when she got to the dog's home, she found that the mother dog had already been claimed. She was glad for the dog's sake, but terribly disappointed. She thought of poor Mrs. getting exhausted by too many puppies, and of Mr. Dearly, who might easily refuse to come out of the cupboard for a good night's sleep, and she began to think she never would find a foster mother. It was now almost dark, a gloomy, wet October evening. It had been raining all afternoon, but Mrs. Dearly hadn't minded when she was feeling hopeful. Now, as she started back for London, the weather made her feel more and more depressed. And the rain got so heavy that the windscreen wipers could hardly keep pace with it. She was driving across a lonely stretch of common when she saw what looked like a bundle lying on the road ahead of her. She slowed down, and as she drew closer, she saw that it was not a bundle, but a dog. Instantly, she thought it must have been run over. Dreading what she might find, she stopped the car and got out. At first, she thought the dog was dead, but as she bent down, it struggled to its feet, showing no signs of injury. It was so plastered with mud that she could not see what kind of dog it was. What she could see, by the light from the car's headlights, was the poor creature's pitiful thinness. She spoke to it gently. Its drooping tail gave a feeble flick, and then dropped again. "I can't leave it here," thought Mrs. Dearly, "even if it hasn't been run over. It must be near starvation. Oh dear." With 17 dogs at home already, she had no wish to take back a stray, but she knew she would never bring herself to just hand this poor thing in at a police station. She patted it and tried to get it to follow her. It was willing to, but its legs were so wobbly that she picked it up and carried it. It felt like a sack of bones. And as she noticed this, she also noticed something else. Hurriedly, she laid the dog on the seat of the car on a rug and turned on the light. Then she saw that this was a mother dog, and that in spite of its starving condition, it still had some milk to give. She sprang into the car and drove as fast as she could. Quite soon she was in the London suburbs. She knew it would still take her some time to get home, because of the traffic, so she stopped at a little restaurant. Here the owner let her buy some milk and some cold meat, and lent her his own dog's dish. The starving dog ate and drank ravenously, then at once settled to sleep. The nice owner of the restaurant took back his dishes and wished Mrs. Dearly luck as she drove away. She got home just as the splendid vet was arriving to see Mrs. and the puppies. He carried the stray dog in and down to the warm kitchen. After a careful examination, he said he thought her thinness was due more to having had puppies than to long starvation, and that, if she was fed well, the milk intended for her own puppies might continue. He guessed they had been taken away from her, and she had got lost looking for them. "She ought to have a bath," said Nanny Cook, "or she'll give our puppies fleas." The splendid vet said a bath was a good idea, so the dog was carried into a little room which had been fitted as a laundry. Nanny Cook got on with the bath as fast as she could, because she was afraid Mr. Dearly might want to do the job himself. Mrs. Dearly had gone upstairs to tell him what was happening. The stray seemed delighted with the warm water. She had just been covered with soap when Pongo came back from a walk with Nanny Butler and ran through the open door of the laundry. "He won't hurt a lady," said the splendid vet. "I hope not. Not when she's going to help nurse his puppies," said Nanny Cook. Pongo stood on his hind legs and kissed the wet dog on the nose, telling her how glad he was to see her and how grateful his wife would be. But no human heard him. The stray said, "Well, I'll do my best, but I can't promise anything." No human heard that either. Just then Mr. Dearly came hurrying in to see the new arrival.
"What kind of dog is she?"
he asked. At that moment, Nanny Cook began to rinse off the soap, and everyone gave a gasp. This dog was a Dalmatian too, but her spots, instead of being black, were brown, which in Dalmatians is called not brown, but liver.
18 Dalmatians under one roof,
said Mr. Dearly gloatingly.
Couldn't be better.
But it could, as he was one day to learn. Wet, the poor liver-spotted dog looked thinner than ever.
"We'll call her Perdita,"
said Mrs. Dearly, and explained to the nannies that this was after a character in Shakespeare.
"She was lost, and the Latin word for lost is perditus."
Then she patted Pongo, who was looking particularly intelligent, and said anyone would think he understood. And indeed he did. For though he had very little Latin beyond cave canem, he had, as a young dog, devoured Shakespeare, in a tasty leather binding. Perdita was dried in front of the kitchen fire and given another meal. The splendid vet said she ought to start mothering puppies as soon as possible, to encourage her to provide more milk. So, after she was quite dry and had taken a nap, 2 puppies were removed from the cupboard while Mrs. went out for a little air. The splendid vet said she would not know they had gone, which is possible, as she could not count as well as Pongo could. But she knew all about those puppies going, because Pongo had told her, and she had sent polite messages to Perdita. Mrs. felt a bit unhappy about giving any puppies up, but she knew it was for their good. Before leaving, the splendid vet warned the Dearlys that if Perdita could not feed the puppies, they must not be returned to Mrs., for her sense of smell would tell her that they had been with another dog, and she might turn against them. And this does happen with some dogs. It would never have happened with Mrs., but it will have already been seen that she and Pongo were rather unusual dogs. And so was Perdita. And so, if people only realized it, are many dogs. In fact, usual dogs are really more unusual than unusual dogs. Anyway, Perdita was able to feed the 2 puppies. Pongo went upstairs and told Mrs. so, though to the Dearlys it only sounded like the thumping of his tail. Then he said good night and went back to the kitchen, where his basket was ready for him. Perdita had the basket Mrs. usually slept in. She had fed and washed the 2 puppies and was now having a light supper. The splendid vet had said she must eat all she possibly could to get her strength back. Pongo had a snack himself to encourage her. Then the nannies went back to bed, and the kitchen was left in darkness, except for the glow of the fire. And when the 2 puppies were asleep, Perdita told Pongo her story. She had been born in a large country house, not far from the common where Mrs. Dearly had found her. Although very pretty, she had been less valuable than her brothers and sisters, and her tail inclined to curl. It had straightened as she grew older. And no one rich or important wanted to be her pet. She was given to a farmer who, though not cruel to her, never gave her the love all Dalmatians need, and he let her run wild, which is not good for any kind of dog. A time came when she felt a great desire to marry, but no marriage was arranged for her, and, as the farm was over a mile from any village, no dog had come courting her. So, one day, she set out to find a husband for herself. Her way to the village lay across the common, where she saw a large, handsome car, which had been driven onto the grass. A group of people were having a picnic, and with them was a superb liver-spotted Dalmatian. Now, liver-spotted Dalmatians are unusual. Perdita had been the only one in her family, and always thought herself a freak. She instantly knew that the dog on the common was no freak, but a most valuable animal, for he wore a magnificent collar and was being offered a piece of chicken by a richly dressed lady. At that moment, he saw Perdita. It was love at first sight. Without even bothering to eat the chicken, he came bounding over to her, and they were away into the wood together before anyone could stop them. Here they made swift arrangements for their marriage, promising to love each other always. Then the happy husband told his wife she must, of course, come and live with him, and led her back to the common. But as they reached it, along came the farmer Perdita lived with, and his rattling old car. He dragged her into it, and the picnic party bundled her husband into their car. Both dogs struggled and howled, but it was useless. The cars drove off in opposite directions. 9 weeks after her marriage, Perdita had 8 puppies. The farmer didn't give her any extra food or help to feed the puppies himself, so she got thinner and thinner. By the time her family was a month old, she was just skin and bone. Then the farmer put down some food for the puppies to eat, and they quickly learned how to. But they still went on taking all the milk Perdita could give them, so she never had a chance to regain her weight. She was such a very young mother, barely full-grown herself, but she loved her babies dearly and did all she could for them. And as she got thinner, they got fatter. The spots on Dalmatians begin to come through after 2 weeks. By the time Perdita's family was 6 weeks old, it was obvious that they were going to be beautifully marked and very valuable. Perdita heard the farmer say so to a stranger who came to the farm one morning. She was still helping to feed them. They would eat all the farmer offered and then come to her for more milk. Then she and they would all have a happy sleep in the old box she'd been given for a bed. One afternoon, she woke to find not one puppy in bed with her. She searched the farmyard. No puppies anywhere. She ran onto the road, fearing they might have been run over. On and on she went, pausing every few minutes to bark. No answering puppy barks came to her. Soon it began to rain. She thought of the puppies all getting wet and barked more and more desperately. A car nearly ran her over. She only saved herself by jumping into a muddy ditch, where the mud even got into her eyes and ears. By the time she reached the common where she had met with her husband, she was shivering and weak on her legs. The thought of her lost husband added to the misery at the loss of her puppies. She had eaten nothing since the previous afternoon. The farmer only gave her 1 meal a day. At last, faint with hunger and utterly broken-spirited, she collapsed. And there, not long after, Mrs. Dearly had found her. That was Perdita's whole story, except that she never told Pongo that the farmer had named her Spotty, because she liked Perdita so much better. Pongo sympathized with all his heart and did his best to comfort her. He said he did not think the puppies were lost. It was more likely that they had been sold, perhaps to the stranger who came by to see them. And this might be the best thing that could have happened to them, for if they were valuable, they were sure to be well taken care of. There would never have been enough food at the farm for them when they got really big. Perdita knew all this was true, and the 2 tiny puppies in the basket with her were wonderfully comforting. So were the kind things Pongo said about being grateful to her for feeding them. Soon she felt much happier and slid into a warm, well-fed sleep. Pongo lay awake for a long time, wishing Mrs. and all the puppies could have been with him in the firelit kitchen. He strolled over and looked at the 2 puppies asleep with Perdita, and felt proud and protective, and extremely sorry for Perdita. Really, she was a very pretty girl, if not a patch on his missus. Then he went back to his basket, had a last wash, and settled down. The fire sank lower. Soon the kitchen was lit only by a faint light from a street lamp on the outer circle. Pongo slept, Perdita slept, and the two puppies, who had come successfully through their first day in the world, slept as peacefully as if they had been with their own mother. Up in the cupboard, Mrs. had just served supper for 8, and was a trifle tired. Mr. Dearly had just served supper for 5, and was so exhausted by his day of puppy feeding that he had to crawl out of the cupboard on his hands and knees. Mrs. Dearly got him in bed and fed him with hot milk from a thermos. They slept with their door open in case Mrs. needed anything, but she was very peaceful. Though, just before she fell asleep, she did wonder a little about the strange female down in the kitchen with Pongo. She didn't worry exactly, she just wondered. On the top floor, Nanny Cook slept dreaming of Dalmatian puppies dressed as babies, and Nanny Butler slept dreaming of babies dressed as Dalmatian puppies. What with 4 humans, 3 dogs, and 15 puppies, it really was a very sleepful house. Chapter 4. Cruella de Vil Pays 2 Calls. The next day, 5 more puppies were brought down to Perdita, and she fed them splendidly. So Mr. Dearly went to his business. He hurried back early to do some pup feeding, and found that Mrs. Dearly was feeding the upstairs puppies, and the nannies were taking it in turns to feed the kitchen puppies. He was a little jealous, but soon got over it, for he knew that what really mattered was that the pups should get plenty of milk without exhausting Mrs. and poor, thin Perdita too much. Perdita now had her bed in the dresser cupboard, where there would not be too much light for the puppies' eyes. These began to open in 8 days, and a week after that, the puppies' spots began to show. What a day it was when Mr. Dearly sighted the first spot! After that, spots came thick and fast, though they would not all be through for some months. In a very few days, it was possible to recognize every pup by its spots. There were 7 girls and 8 boys. The prettiest of all the girls was the tiny pup whose life Mr. Dearly had saved at birth. But she was very small and delicate. When pigs have families, the smallest, weakest piglet is often called the cadpig. Mr. Dearly always called the tiny puppy Cadpig, which can be a nice little name when spoken with love. Patch, the pup born with a black ear, was still the biggest and strongest puppy. He always seemed to be next to Cadpig, as if these two already knew they were going to be special friends. There was a fat, funny boy puppy called Roly-Poly, who was always getting into mischief. And the most striking pup of all was one who had a perfect horseshoe of spots on his back, and therefore had been named Lucky. He was terrifically energetic, and showed from the beginning that he was going to be the ringleader of all his brothers and sisters. A few days after the first spots came through, something very upsetting happened. Perdita's milk supply failed. She was miserable about it, because she loved the 7 puppies she had been feeding as much as if they were her own, and she was very, very frightened. Now that she was no longer useful, why should the Dearlys keep her in this warm, comfortable house, where, for the first time in her life, she had been given enough to eat? But it was not the food and warmth that mattered most to her. It was the love. She had been treated as one of the family. The thought of leaving it all was more than she could bear. And what happened to dogs nobody wanted? All sorts of fears awoke in her heart. The morning she found she had no milk to offer at all, she crept unhappily out of the dresser cupboard and saw Mrs. Dearly having a mid-morning cup of tea with the nannies. Mrs. Dearly held out a biscuit. Perdita did not take it. She just laid her head against Mrs. Dearly's knee and gave a little moan. Mrs. Dearly stroked her and said, "Poor Perdita,
I wish we could explain to her that we're helping to feed her 7 puppies, so she doesn't need to worry. Darling Perdita, you are washing them beautifully and keeping them warm at night. We couldn't possibly do without you."
She had no hope of being understood. She just thought her soothing tone would be comforting. But Perdita was picking up more and more human words every day and understood perfectly. She was wild with relief. For the first time, she showed really high spirits, jumping up and dashing back to wash the puppies all over again. Not many days after this, all pups began learning to lap milk for themselves and could soon eat milk puddings and bread soaked in gravy. They were now much too big to go on living in cupboards. Mrs. and her 8 were moved to the laundry, while Perdita's 7 had the run of the kitchen, where they got terribly under the nanny's feet.
What a pity they can't be in the laundry with their brothers and sisters. Mrs. might hurt them. She wouldn't know them for her own now, and she and Perdita would fight.
Pongo heard this and decided something must be done. For he knew that whatever usual dogs would do, Mrs. would know her own puppies, and she and Perdita would not fight. So he had a word with Mrs. under the laundry door, and that afternoon, when the nannies were upstairs, he took a flying leap at the door and managed to burst it open. Out hurtled Mrs. and 8 puppies, and when the nannies came downstairs, they found Pongo, Mrs., and Perdita all playing happily with the 15 puppies, who were now so mixed up that it took the nannies all their time to decide which pups had been brought up by which mother. After that, all pups lived in the laundry. The door was kept open, and a piece of wood was put across it, high enough to keep all puppies in, but low enough to be jumped by Mrs. and Perdita when they wanted to come into the kitchen. By now it was December, but the days were fine and surprisingly warm, so the puppies were able to play in the area several times a day. They were quite safe there, for the gate at the top of the steps which led to the street now had a strong spring to keep it closed. One morning, when the 3 dogs and the 15 puppies were taking the air, Pongo saw a tall woman looking down over the area railings. He recognized her at once. It was Cruella de Vil. As usual, she was wearing her absolutely simple white mink cloak, but she now had a brown mink coat under it. Her hat was made of fur, her boots were lined with fur, and she wore big fur gloves.
What will she wear when it's really cold?
Thought Nanny Butler, coming out into the area. Cruella opened the gate and walked down the steps, saying how pretty the puppies were. Lucky, always the ringleader, came running toward her and nibbled at the fur round the tops of her boots. She picked him up and placed him against her cloak, as if he were something to be worn.
"Such a pretty horseshoe,"
she said, looking at the spots on his back.
"But they all have pretty markings. Are they old enough to leave their mother yet?" "Very nearly, but they won't have to. Mr. and Mrs. Dearly are going to keep them all."
Sometimes the nannies wondered just how this was going to be managed.
"How nice,"
said Cruella, and began going up the steps, still holding Lucky against her cloak. Pongo, Mrs. and Perdita all barked sharply, and Lucky reached up and nibbled Cruella's ear. She gave a scream and dropped him. Nanny Butler was quick enough to catch him in her apron.
"That woman,"
said Nanny Cook, who had just come out into the area.
"She's enough to frighten the spots of a pup. What's the matter, Lucky?"
For Lucky had dashed into the laundry and was gulping down water. Cruella's ear had tasted of pepper. Every day now the puppies grew stronger and more independent. They now fed themselves entirely, eating shredded meats as well as soaked bread and milk puddings. Mrs. and Perdita were quite happy to leave them now for an hour or more at a time, so the 3 grown-up dogs took Mrs. Dearly and Nanny Butler for a good walk in the park every morning, while Nanny Cook got the lunch and kept an eye on the puppies. One morning, when she had just let them out into the area, the front doorbell rang. It was Cruella de Vil, and when she heard Mrs. Dearly was out, she said she would come in and wait. She asked many questions about the Dearlys and the puppies, and went on talking so long that at last Nanny Cook said she really must go down and let the puppies in, as a cold wind was blowing. Cruella then said she would walk in the park and hope to meet Mrs. Dearly.
"Perhaps I can see her from here,"
she said, strolling to the window. Nanny Cook also went to the window to point out the nearest way into the park. As she did so, she noticed a small black van standing in front of the house. At that very moment, it drove off at a great pace. Cruella suddenly seemed in a hurry. She almost ran out of the house and down the front steps.
"Can't think how she can move so fast, huddled in all of those furs,"
thought Nanny Cook, closing the front door.
"And those poor pups, in only their own little skins, catching their death of cold."
She hurried down to the kitchen and opened the door to the area. Not a pup was in sight.
"They're playing me a trick. They're hiding,"
Nanny Cook told herself. But she knew there was nowhere for the 15 puppies to hide. All the same, she looked behind every tub of shrubs, where not even a mouse could have hidden. The gate at the top of the steps was firmly closed, and no pup could possibly have opened it. Still, she ran up to the street and searched wildly.
"They've been stolen! I know they have!" she moaned, bursting into tears. "They must have been in that black van I saw driving away."
Cruella de Vil seemed to have changed her mind about going into the park. She was already halfway back to her own house, walking very fast indeed. That's the end of our story for tonight. We hope you enjoyed. If you want to put your favorite story forward, our email is myslumbertales@gmail.com. Sleep tight.